you find that there are many remarks about style as well as substance. One memo by a censor concluded, this is a negative one, it is a compilation without taste and without discernment. So the censor did not approve it. It doesn't have good taste. Another rejected a defense of Orthodox Catholicism simply because it was badly written. Quote, it is not a book at all. You cannot tell what the author's purpose is until you have finished it. He advances in one direction, then doubles back. His arguments are often weak and superficial. His style, in an attempt to be lively, merely becomes petulant. In the effort to turn a pretty phrase, he frequently looks silly and ridiculous, end quote. So the censor refused to give an approbation to this book. Why? Well, it's somewhat like an editor today. No, Thomas? If the book is badly written, has no good structure, and this is how the censor is operating. I found that fascinating. In fact, the censors were often men of letters, like the authors whose works they censored. One of their main concerns, as one of them put it, was, I'm quoting him, to defend the honor of French literature, end quote. That's what the censor is doing. So censorship was essentially positive in the 18th century. It was a royal stamp of approval necessary for obtaining a privilege. You can think of it as something like, if you've been to England, the notices on jars of jam or consumer goods that say, by special appointment to Her Majesty the Queen. I don't know if you've seen these. I've always been amazed that the Queen is giving her approval to bits of jam or clothing. The notion of a royal stamp of approval goes way back in history, including the history of books. Now, of course, there was more to censorship than that. The French administration had developed a large bureaucracy called the Direction de la Librairie in order to administer approbations and privileges. In fact, the very word bureaucracy comes into use just about this time, in the middle of the 18th century. This is a big operation. By 1789, the Direction, this administrative part of the French state, included nearly 200 censors. And they were proud of their title, proud to be listed in the Royal Almanac as censeur du roi. So they're not hiding it, they're proud of it. Now, there was a great deal of paperwork and complicated procedures. I just am showing you some examples of how the bureaucracy used forms to process applications to get approbations and privileges. My point is simply, this is a large operation involving a great many people and a great many intelligent people too. So I won't go into the details of these, but this will give you some of the flavor, just looking at it, of what this bureaucracy was like. This is a privilege that's actually written into a large volume, which makes the book legal. Once it appears in this volume, which is kept by the Booksellers Guild, then it functions as copyright. But the concept of copyright is a modern concept. It existed in England, of course, since 1710, but it won't exist in France until the French Revolution. So what we're talking about is a way to control the printed word in a process of bureaucratization of an archaic French state. Now, there was more to censorship than that, and I should mention briefly what you could call post-publication censorship. Some books with approbations and privileges, legal books, caused a scandal because they contain offensive things, and somehow they got through the system. The most famous cases are that of the Encyclopédie of Diderot and the book called De l'Esprit of Helvétius. So there were scandals, but the people who have studied this concentrate on these very unusual examples. And I want to study the everyday business of censors, which, as I say, was largely positive. But most books that were threatening in any way, either to the church or the state or morals, this is a wonderful time of quasi-pornographic writing on the part of the French. They're not printed in Paris. They are printed in what I call a fertile crescent of publishing houses outside of France. They're smuggled into France through an elaborate underground system, and they sell like hotcakes. Also, because there were so many of them, I estimate more than half of the books that were currently on the marketplace were produced outside France, never went through the censorship. The French police tried to stop them. And so part of the story of censorship is the effect of the police to raid bookshops, to seize authors and put them in the Bastille. It was, in that respect, very negative and painful. Lives were ruined in the Bastille. You know, some historians say that Bastille was like a 2-star hotel. Well, it was a bad place, believe me, not because they tortured people, but if you disappeared for usually 3 months or 4 months, that was enough to ruin your business if you were a bookseller or a publisher. So lives were broken in the Bastille, and in my book on censorship, I give you some examples of this. Well, that's the case of France. I'm moving fast because I want to describe 3 systems. The next one is that of communist East Germany. So we will jump over 2 centuries and talk about censorship as it existed very recently. I happen to have been in Berlin in 1989, 1990, at the time of the collapse of the wall. I had some friends who were East German writers and publishers, and they, of course, knew the censors. So, right after the fall of the wall, they offered to introduce me to some censors. Having studied censorship in 18th century France, I thought, to meet real censors of flesh and blood was thrilling. The censors, they hesitated a little bit, but then I assured them through my friends that I was not on a witch hunt. I wanted to understand how they did their work. What was it? So they met me in their offices at 90 Clara-Zetkin-Strasse in East Berlin. Now, I was the first American they'd ever seen. This was just after the fall of the wall. They had never been in West Berlin, not to mention anywhere in Western Europe. They had lived totally in the Soviet Empire. So they were a little suspicious of this strange creature who appeared in their office. But they were eager to talk because East Germany had ceased to exist. It had collapsed. And it had not yet been united with West Germany. So we had a very interesting conversation. And it began with them pointing a finger at me and saying, "You have censorship in your country." "Oh, really?" I said. "Yes, it's the marketplace." Right, Thomas? Well, I knew that argument, the Marxist argument, so I said, okay. But you are censors. What is your understanding of censorship? And one of them, there were 2, a man called Hans-Jürgen Wesener said, first, he reached into a drawer of his desk. He pulled out an enormous document. And he said, in one word, planning. censorship is planning. Literature should be planned, like everything else in a socialist system. Literature is a matter of social engineering. And the document he showed me was the plan for the year 1990, a year that never existed because the wall fell. He gave it to me, and I studied it later. It was very interesting to read. I'm skipping some. So this is the first page in the plan, but imagine about 500 pages in which every single book that was to be published is described with systematic information about the author, the publisher, the press run, and so on. For historians of the book, it was an incredibly rich source. In order to understand, though, how the censors did their job, it's important to see the way they fit into the power structure of the GDR, East Germany. Now, again, I don't expect you can read all of the details, but the point of this diagram, which is my diagram, not theirs, is that you see below that line in the middle of the page, the structure of the administration. So censors worked in the Ministry of Culture. And the Ministry of Culture is one of several ministries which together make up the East German government. But in all Soviet bloc countries, there was a parallel structure, which was the Communist Party. And the Central Committee of the Communist Party had divisions, including one division with a wonderful name, Cultura, culture. So we're in the Institute of Culture here in Mexico City, but by Cultura, they meant it seriously. In German, the word has a lot of power. The point is that the censors in the Ministry of Culture had to present the plan to the communist apparatchiks in the Department of Culture that was part of the communist organization running parallel to the government. And when they tried to describe their work, they said, we developed the plan, and then we have to get the approval of these apparatchiks, who are Philistines. And they described themselves as defending the quality of German literature against these know-nothings who were party members. Of course, they were party members too. And it turned out to be more complicated than that. But in their eyes, they were actually defending the honor of German literature, the way the French censors had been doing it. And they especially admired their boss, who was the #2 person in the Ministry of Culture, a man called Klaus Höpke. So they actually were deeply integrated into the literary world of East Germany. They knew the writers. They knew the people who wrote the book reviews. They participated in a collective enterprise in which everyone is collaborating at every moment. And they're trying to maintain standards, but nonetheless to respect certain taboos that were clearly defined by the party. I'll give you 3 examples that they named to me. No manuscript should have in it the word ecology. Why? Because it would evoke the pollution in East Germany, which was really spectacular. No manuscript should use the word critical. Why? It might suggest the existence of dissenters within East Germany. No manuscript should use the word 1930s. Why? Well, it could suggest Stalinist purges. Better to use the first half of the 20th century. They were full of information about specific things that should be avoided when they would cut manuscripts with like blue pencil out things. But that was mainly unusual.